Hope Not Hate have put out a report called State of Hate, and it's quite an interesting, if not amusing, read. I went through it and I'm going to cover some of the contents of it here. On the screen, you can see a list of the contributors. Now, feel free to look up these people for yourselves. A lot of them are on Twitter, so just go and scrutinize their views for yourself. It's pretty predictable, as you'll see. Here we have one of the contributors, Matthew Collins. Now, Matthew is clearly a fat state, but even more interesting than that is the fact that he's a former National Front member. That's correct, he was with a legitimate far-right group, National Front, and I'll link in the description some of the details of his past. He's no angel, let's say. Now, this is funny for purely reasons of hypocrisy. Whenever Hope Not Hate cover their favourite person in the world, Tommy Robinson, Stephen Yaxley Lennon, they will always refer to his past. Former EDL leader, convicted fraudster, thug, etc., etc. Yet they do not apply this same standard to Matthew Collins. So, hypocrisy. I'd recommend you all go and have a scroll of this guy's Twitter feed. It's fascinating from a psychological standpoint because it's quite clear and obvious that the guy is massively overcompensating for his own past racism and racist affiliations. It's just so predictable. The amount of projection that comes from the regressive left, let's say, and Hope Not Hate are definitely far left / regressive leftists. So that was Fat Matt, and now we have Nick Lowes. Nick Lowes is the head honcho at Hope Not Hate, and he's the editor on this report that they've produced. Now, Nick could not look more like a paedophile if he tried. Look at him, he's just the textbook child abuser, isn't he? It would not surprise me if future evidence or allegations came out about this guy fiddling kids. Anyway, let's do a brief content analysis before I get into some specifics. So, it's a 104-page document. There are 46 pages on the far right, a mere 6 pages on anti-Semitism, and a mere 6 pages on Islamist extremism. So that is more than 6 times more pages on the far right that this report has done than on Islamist extremism. And to me, that begs the question, is this level of emphasis reflective of the real world, what's happening in reality in terms of the manifestation of the ideologies of the far right and Islamism, or Islam as I prefer to call it? Let's do some statistics. I like statistics. Doesn't everyone like statistics? Since the year 2000, I've done 3 classification of terror attacks, terror incidents. We have ones from Muslims, which could be classed as Islamic. We have far right ones, and I've also done a tally for IRA. So this is the Muslim / Islamic tally since the year 2000. So number of deaths, we have 85. Number of injuries, we have 974. For the far right, number of deaths since 2000 is 3. That's correct, 3. Number of injuries by far right terrorists and terrorist incidents is 10. For the IRA, the number of deaths since the early 2000s, it was pretty much, and then they stopped after that. So the number of deaths from the IRA in Britain in terrorist incidents since 2000 is zero deaths. Injuries, we have 7. So the quick tally for Muslim terrorist deaths and injuries is 1,059. The tally for far right deaths and injuries is 13, 13, and the number of deaths and injuries by the IRA is 7. So in total, all the terrorist incidents since 2000, pretty much, I'll go into that shortly, we have a total of 1,079 deaths and injuries from terrorist incidents since the year 2000. Muslims are responsible for, wait for it, 98% of all deaths and injuries via terror attacks in Britain since the year 2000. 98%. The far right is responsible for 1.2%, and the rest, of course, goes to the IRA. So Hope Not Hate, as I said, they've dedicated 46 pages to the problem of the far right in Britain in their report. They've dedicated a mere 6 pages to Islamist extremism, as they've called it. Meanwhile, Muslims are responsible for 98% of the deaths and injuries in terror attacks in Britain. 98% versus 1.2% for the far right. In what world does the disproportionate amount of focus and attention make any sense for Hope Not Hate? It makes no sense. The clear and obvious problem, nearly 100 times worse of a problem, is Islamic extremism, or Islamic fundamentalism, to be more accurate with words. Muslim terror attacks. But hate isn't only Muslim terror attacks. There's this list here. All of these are disproportionately Muslims. These problems are disproportionately from Muslims. None of this is included in the report. And the bit of information that I said I would add later on is that the Muslim number, the total of deaths and injuries, could have been higher. I've actually omitted a couple of Muslim stabbings that are or have kind of half been classed as terror acts. I've omitted them. So there's actually more deaths and injuries that I haven't counted on the tally, and Muslims still account for 98%. Now, let's get into the proportion. Muslims are roughly 6% of the British population. So 6% of the British population is committing 98% of the terrorism. Then there's the joyous fact that we are monitoring some 3,000 wannabe jihadis, 3,000 of them. Then there's a fact that there's between 20 and 35,000 Muslims that are of concern. So to compare, these jihadis and Islamists and wannabe jihadis want to kill and maim and injure people. Many of them go and fight with ISIS and other Islamic terror groups. They go around murdering people, cutting off heads, raping women. Compare that to the far right with their handful of arrests, their handful of deaths and injuries in pretty much 20 years, and the so-called hate incidents that consist of putting a fucking bacon sandwich near a mosque. Then there's the added bonus from the Muslim demographic of the massively disproportionate child rape / grooming, street gang grooming that they do. Again, 6% roughly of the British population is Muslim, and Muslims commit over 85%, close to 90% of the child rape / street gang grooming. So 6% of the population commit 98% of the terrorism. 6% of the population commit 90% of the rape of British children. So it's safe to say Muslims are a problem. So you've all just heard the scale of the problem in statistical terms. I've just clearly broken it down and explained it to you. Now, some more content analysis for this State of Hate report. As I said earlier, or referenced earlier, their absolute focus, their scapegoat, their boogeyman is Tommy Robinson. They are oh so concerned and focused on Tommy Robinson. Tommy Robinson's name is mentioned 40 times in this report, 40. Stephen Yaxley Lennon is mentioned 19 times, 19. The term far right is mentioned 139 times. It's actually obsession at this point, and let's be charitable to Hope Not Hate and grant that Tommy Robinson is a thug, etc. How many people has Tommy Robinson killed and injured or been responsible for killing and injuring? Next to zero. Now this obsession, or hysteria really, I'd call it hysteria, in terms of the proportion of the level of focus and attention that Hope Not Hate, the mainstream media, politicians, basically neo-Marxists, the level of attention they give Tommy Robinson is demented, quite simply. It's out of kilter with reality in relation to the level of problem that Tommy Robinson actually represents. So here you can see a definition of hate. I'm a stickler for definitions. I like to use words correctly and use them with their widely understood definition. So hate really means a strong dislike of something, or you can interpret the word as it says here. So hate is important in the context of both Hope Not Hate, in terms of their message, their aims, what they focus on, and in terms of this report. For me, hate isn't a problem. It's perfectly fine. It's even justified sometimes to hate something or someone, or especially ideas and ideologies and even religions. I have no issue whatsoever with hatred of religions. Hatred of people, even, I don't really mind that, depending on how far you go. When it comes to obviously attacking people, assaulting them, hurting them, abusing them, being aggressive without provocation for no reason, obviously I'm against that. Outside of that, people are justified to hate all sorts of things without being criminalized for it. Now, the police, mainstream media, political class are all intent on pushing hate itself as some sort of crime. So if you display hate towards certain things, and I'll show the Met definition of hate crime shortly, you can get prosecuted for it. And clearly that is silly, it's nonsense. It shouldn't happen in a functioning liberal democracy with functioning and rational law and order. Hate should not be a crime. Now what they try and do is conflate hate with physical attack, with physical assault, with verbal abuse, with quite strong levels of aggression, say harassment, even vandalism. These things already have their own classifications and descriptions and are their own crimes. There are no such thing as hate crimes. All of these things have their own separate distinction in terms of what type of crime they are. And now for the word, one of the favourite words in their arsenal, the far left, I mean, outside of the phrase far right or racist, is the word fascist. Now, a fascist is someone who subscribes to, agrees with, adheres to fascism. So, fascism is a governmental system led by a dictator having complete power, forcibly suppressing opposition and criticism, regimenting all industry, commerce, etc., and emphasizing an aggressive nationalism and often racism. And a fascist, of course, is someone, as I just said, who subscribes to the philosophy, principles, or methods of fascism. So let's take Owen Jones, for example, of a guy who constantly misapplies this term to people who clearly are not fascists. He consistently applies this term to Tommy Robinson. Tommy Robinson doesn't support governmental systems led by dictators. He is not for forcible suppression of opposition or of critics and dissidents. He's not for regimenting industry and commerce. The only part of that has any relevance is his endorsement of nationalism. And I wouldn't say he's an aggressive nationalist. He's basically a civic nationalist. So when a regressive leftist or far leftist, such as Owen Jones, uses the term fascist, what he actually means is nationalist. Now, the subversion and inversion of language, of course, is a well known sort of Orwellian tactic that is used en masse by the far left and not just the far left, neo Marxists in general. So you'll have politicians do this as well and people in the mainstream media. To a large extent, when you're dealing with a neo Marxist, a regressive leftist, far leftist, you aren't even speaking the same language, especially when it comes to certain things and specific phrases. And the next phrase is the far right. Now, after this, I'll show you and read through the hope not hate definition, which of course is nothing like the actual dictionary definition or the widely understood definition. So, far right politics are politics further on the right of the left right spectrum than the standard political right, particularly in terms of extreme nationalism, nativist ideologies, and authoritarian tendencies. The term is often used to describe Nazism, neo-Nazism, fascism, neo-fascism, and other ideologies or organizations that feature ultranationalist, chauvinist, xenophobic, racist, anti-communist, or reactionary views. These can lead to oppression and violence against groups of people based on their supposed inferiority or their perceived threat to the native ethnic group, nation state, or ultra-conservative traditional social institutions. So for me, that is a largely accurate kind of summary of what far right actually is and who it applies to. Now, there may be some debate as to whether Nazis are actual far right, given that Nazis stand for German National Socialists, the German National Socialist Workers' Party, to be precise. So Nazism, in name anyway, is socialism, and socialism is not on the far right. However, certain elements of Nazism was certainly fascistic. So in that respect, Nazism is somewhat far right and it's somewhat accurate to class Nazism as far right on the political spectrum. So, again, this term is almost constantly misapplied to people who aren't actually far right. Tommy Robinson is next to none of those things. Well, I'd say none of those things. Anne Marie Waters is none of those things. And virtually all of the people they apply this label to, it's inaccurate and it's a slur. But as I said earlier, when you're dealing with the regressive left and neo-Marxists, you are speaking a different language. So when they say far right, they don't mean far right in the dictionary definition sense. Here's a hope not hate definition of far right extremism or far right. Generally speaking, the far right is an umbrella term that encompasses those individuals and organizations whose political outlook is more extreme or hardline than those of the center right of the political spectrum, primarily in cultural terms, brackets race / immigration / identity. In practice, this usually means a belief in nationalism, brackets exceptionalism, of either a race or country rather than mere patriotism. Coupled with this is a belief that the nation, either geographic or racial, is in decay or crisis and radical action is required to halt or reverse it. The nation, however defined, usually includes an in-group that is under threat and an out-group / enemy, usually now identified as Islam and Muslims, though this can be any minority community. As an umbrella term, it encompasses people and movements ranging from the democratic, populist, radical right through to the extreme authoritarian far right. So there you have it. Much of that is nonsense, and they've cast their net nice and wide to encompass essentially anyone who classes themselves as a patriot, as nationalistic, as wanting to improve things in Britain, as wanting to do something about Islam, the increase of Muslims, the Islamization of the West, who speaks against free speech. So their definition, it's a nice catch-all that covers anyone that they want to cover. Of course, it doesn't bear any resemblance to the reality, the actual definition and meaning of far right, but they're not about reality. They're about saying what they think is true and running with that. It's quite insane, really, when you think about it. Quite dastardly. So here is the insane waffle that semi-covers and describes what a hate crime is or what constitutes a hate crime. And this is, believe it or not, directly from the Metropolitan Police. Metropolitan Police cover a large section of London, which is, of course, the capital of England. So here we go with the neo-Marxist nonsense. A hate incident is any incident which the victim or anyone else thinks is based on someone's prejudice towards them because of their race, religion, sexual orientation, disability, or because they are transgender. So there you have the protected characteristics. Okay? Not all hate incidents will amount to criminal offences. Translation: hate crimes are not actual crimes or criminal offences. But it is equally important that these are reported and recorded by the police. Of course, because the recording of non-crimes and their use in stats, which I will show you shortly, can push a certain political agenda that can justify authoritarianism, restrictions of speech, restrictions of civil liberties. Evidence of the hate element is not a requirement. Translation: this non-crime of hate does not require any evidence. You do not need to personally perceive the incident to be hate-related. Translation: you don't even have to be the recipient of said hate crime. It would be enough if another person, a witness, or even a police officer thought that the incident was hate-related. And there you have it. So, a quick example, fairly recent in Britain, this actually happened. I've mentioned it in other videos, but it covers this insanity perfectly. A teenage girl on Instagram reposted lyrics of a black American rapper. Contained in these lyrics was the word nigger. Okay? So she shared words on Instagram, not her own words, already published lyrics of a rap song. A police officer, I think a black police officer, Dominique Walker, I think it was. Dominique Walker is the sister, I believe, of Anthony Walker. Anthony Walker was a black kid who was murdered in Liverpool some years ago by a couple of white guys, I think, in what was seen as a racist attack, a racist murder. So the police sister of Anthony Walker saw these lyrics posted online. She took offense to them and she either logged it herself or got someone else to log it as a crime. The teenager was then charged, arrested, dragged through court and prosecuted. She had to pay a fine and she had her civil liberties restricted in terms of a curfew, I believe. I'm not sure if she had to wear a tag as well in relation to her curfew. So this is what hate crime actually ends up doing, this nonsensical, anti-law, anti-reason classification of hate crime. It's complete nonsense. It needs to be abolished yesterday. On top of it being nonsense, it is selectively applied to the victim hierarchy of neo-Marxists, the far left orthodoxies, the protected classes, so Muslims, trannies, brown people, gays, etc. But it is only selectively applied to the neo-Marxist victim classes if these victims have the right politics. So if you're a black person and you're a victim of a so-called hate crime and you report it, or not even if you're the victim, if you want to report someone else. If I want to report a Pakistani Muslim called Hina Khaled for being racist towards John Gaunt in an interview, which is what I actually did do as an experiment to see what would happen, nothing will happen, as I found out. Even though, had it happened maybe the other way around, say a Tommy Robinson event, some white guys had been racist towards some Pakistani Muslim women in hijabs, and that was reported, it would be acted upon. I've no doubt of this. So not only did I attempt to report a hate crime for a Pakistani Muslim abusing a white person unsuccessfully, I attended a Stand Up to Racism event. I went in, I asked a few questions for a period of time. They eventually sussed that I was not sympathetic to their nonsense, and they surrounded me and physically pushed me out of their square, their space. So assault, essentially physical assault, which is an actual real crime unlike hate crime. So I was physically assaulted. I was pushed past a row of police. The square was flanked by police. Must have been maybe 20 odd police around. I say to the police, did you just see that I was physically assaulted? Every single police officer that I asked, I'll link this video in the description for those of you that haven't seen it. Every single police officer I asked whether they saw the crime, they witnessed the crime, they said, no, I didn't see it, no, I didn't see it. So again, the policing of many things in this country is selective according to your politics or according to who is deemed as the victim, who is deemed as the perpetrator. If the politics line up correctly and who is supposed to be the victim is actually the perpetrator, then the police will turn the other cheek. Also, Yanaya English, who is a mixed race girl on YouTube and other stuff, attempted to report David Lammy for a hate crime for his latest racist remarks on Twitter in relation to Stacey Dooley. Goodfella, the Scottish kind of MGTOW YouTuber, also rather hilariously in a video, I'll link that in the description also, very funny, I highly recommend you watch it. He tried to report Nicola Sturgeon for a hate crime against sort of conservatives in her tweets. He tried to report this and he was told, oh, this isn't actually a hate crime. But by the definition that he provided, that he took from the Scottish Police website, it was an actual hate crime. So, as I said, the police selectively apply this stuff. I don't know if the three logs I've spoken about, mine, Yanaya's and Goodfellas, I don't know if they're included in official stats or not. There's sort of no way to measure it. I suspect they aren't included in stats. Et voila, here's some hate crime stats used to justify a narrative and an agenda. Oh, look at that graph, it's going up and up and up. And it shows specific spikes after certain incidents. Number of racially or religiously aggravated offences recorded by the police by month. April 2013 to March 2018. From the Home Office. So look how hate crimes have risen since 2013. Just over 3,000 to a peak of around 6,000 following the far-right racist reaction to Brexit and Islamic terror attacks. So the clear narrative and what they want you to get from these stats is Brexit was racist. After Brexit, the racists went crazy and essentially attacked brown people and foreigners. Then Muslims murder and kill people multiple times, multiple people, and hate crimes against Muslims go up. So again, the narrative is Muslims do something and nasty racists just go and attack innocent Muslims. Now, how many Muslims were actually attacked? When I say attack, I mean assaulted, a physical assault, or abused, like properly abused, shouted at, screamed at, or racially abused, or suffered some property damage or vandalism. How many of these hate crimes are actual crimes? Well, conveniently enough, there is no way to distinguish what types of crimes are covered within hate crimes. At least not if you go solely off a table such as this. Now, there are further stats out there, and funnily enough for you guys, I have already covered these bullshit stats and ripped them apart as they should be ripped apart. So another video I'll link in the description is one I did on a Tell Mama report. Now, Tell Mama is a Muslim propaganda activist group akin to Hope Not Hate, but more specifically dedicated and focused on Muslims being victims. So, in their hate stats for their 2016 report, I think it was, they included a lot of stats relating to hate crimes, and they had a breakdown of the types of hate crimes. Some were like vandalism, property damage, some was harassment, some were physical assaults. Anyway, I tallied up all of the physical assaults suffered by Muslims within the Tell Mama report. And bear in mind, Tell Mama are going to, if not fabricate, they're going to exaggerate the number of assaults suffered by Muslims to obviously inflate their stats and paint a narrative that Muslims are victims of Islamophobia and they're attacked more than anyone and they're really unsafe and Britain is nasty and racist, etc., etc. So I broke down the stats and guess what? Muslims were physically assaulted in Britain 2016 at a rate more than 90 times lower than non-Muslims. I'll repeat that. In Britain 2016, Muslims were physically assaulted at a rate more than 90 times lower than that of non-Muslims. So in terms of physical assault, which I class as an actual crime as opposed to a hate crime, in terms of physical assaults, Muslims are 90 times safer than me or you if you happen to be a non-Muslim. Over 90 times safer. And if you look at the biggest Muslim demographics in terms of countries of origin in Britain, it's Pakistani Muslims and Bangladeshi Muslims. In their own shithole countries of Pakistan and Bangladesh, Muslims are murdered at far higher rates than Muslims are murdered in Britain. So not only in Britain are Muslims safer than non-Muslims, in Bangladesh, Muslims are killed at higher rates than they are in Britain, supposedly Islamophobic society and country that hates Muslims and attacks them. And in Pakistan, Muslims are murdered at higher rates than Muslims are murdered in Britain. So the narrative and message and propaganda is one thing. The facts, the data, the objective reality, which is backed by evidence, completely debunks that. And the same applies to rape stats. Muslims are raped far more in their own Muslim countries than they are here. So consider this hate crime nonsense, this Islamophobia nonsense debunked. Please share this, share the facts that you pick up from this and other videos where I've done statistical analysis and statistical breakdowns, thoroughly debunking and destroying these bullshit narratives. Hate crime isn't a thing, it isn't an issue. Muslims being targeted disproportionately is nonsense. Just take a look at this graphic, have a quick read of it, and Muslims disproportionately targeted, blah blah blah. Islamophobia is rampant and overt, blah blah blah. I've just gone through in about as much detail as you're likely to get online as to why and how this is nonsense. And bear in mind that hate crimes aren't technically criminal, they're not actual crimes. And hate crimes can include shit like, and I'm not even joking, a dog taking a shit, someone looking at you the wrong way, you reporting that you feel afraid, and if you give a good scenario to the police, they'll believe it and log it as a hate crime. It's absurd. And this graphic just shows some prisoners in custody as a result of work from Prevent. And as you can see, Muslims are disproportionately represented. So 6% of the population making up 80% of the prevent terrorism related prisoners. And this is actually underrepresented because, as I said earlier, Muslims commit 98% of successful terror attacks. So 80% is an underestimate. And here's an example of the misapplication of the term far right. So they've got most influential far right figures on social media. So Milo Yiannopoulos is far right. He's not, he's a conservative. Paul Joseph Watson, apparently far right. He's not, he's also a conservative. Ann Coulter, apparently far right. She's not, she's a conservative. Pamela Geller is apparently far right. She's not, she's a conservative as well, I'd say. Tommy Robinson, of course, is far right. He's not. He's not even a conservative. He's not even right wing. He's mostly liberal in his views. Stefan Molyneux is apparently far right. Now, Stefan Molyneux is a weird one. I wouldn't call him a conservative. I don't know how to class him politically. He's not far right. He's not an ethno-nationalist, even though he talks about race and race realism and alt-right related stuff. I wouldn't class him as a racist or even far right. Possibly a libertarian. Carl Benjamin, Sargon of Akkad, is apparently far right. Sargon is pretty much a liberal, a centrist, slightly to the right on some issues perhaps, but not conservative. I wouldn't even call him right wing. He's certainly not far right. Katie Hopkins is pretty much a conservative that doesn't have a filter and isn't a pussy. I wouldn't consider her far right either. Mike Cernovich, I don't even know where he stands politically. I know he's not far right. I know I'm pretty sure he has a different race wife, Chinese or Asian or something. Again, probably libertarian, I'd class him as. Lauren Southern, she's not far right. She's not an ethno-nationalist. She's a right-wing conservative, I'd say. Irony being, of course, that some of the people on this influential far-right figures on social media list, such as Milo, such as Pamela Geller, are Jewish. So the real far right, the likes of Nick Griffin, Mark Collett, and others, they don't like Jews. They don't like who they perceive to be Zionists. Tommy Robinson is perceived to be a Zionist shill by the far right, the legitimate far right. Even Lauren Southern, I've seen stuff calling her a Zionist shill by fucking right-wing woke, aka red-pilled YouTubers like Squatting Slav. That gimp, he's done videos saying Lauren Southern's a Zionist shill, Tommy Robinson's a Zionist shill, and Nick Griffin repeats this shit. This segment is who they determine to be alt-light and alt-right. So under alt-light, they have Paul Joseph Watson, which, fair play to Hope Not Hate, I would say is semi-accurate. Now, initially, when sort of Trump started coming to prominence as a sort of front runner for the presidency, and there was a sort of push and surge of support for him, Paul Joseph Watson was one of these people. And initially, this sort of surge of right-leaning, conservative, sort of a bit edgelordy, young internet generation culture sort of movement, if you like, was classified as alt-right. And I think there's a video from that time of Paul Joseph Watson calling himself alt-right. Now, Sargon was never alt-right, not in my eyes, and neither was Count Dankula, Mark Meechan. On the second page for alt-right, they've got Milo Yiannopoulos, which, fair enough, I would class him similar to Paul Joseph Watson. He initially, when alt-right didn't mean sort of far-right, white / ethno-nationalist with sympathies towards Nazis or certain aspects of Nazism with certain fascistic and authoritarian leanings and wholly endorsing Jewish conspiracy theories. That is now what the alt-right is. Back at that period I referenced when Trump started coming to fruition as candidate, the sort of slightly off-kilter, edgelordy conservative movements were regarded as alt-right. So now that's turned to alt-light. That's accurate for Milo. Luke Nash Jones, no, he's certainly not. Luke Nash Jones is just a conservative, pretty much dyed-in-the-wool conservative. Now, for the alt-right, I have to give some ratings to Hope Not Hate because I think they're accurate in their classifications. I won't read this, but it's just to show you who they've got. They've got Millennial Woes. Now, Millennial Woes is a legitimate alt-right figure. He is what I would consider to be far right. I consider him a racist. I've had interactions with him where he's demonstrated this racism. A quick example for you that maybe are skeptical or have an inclination to defend alt-righters as non-racists. Sure, not all alt-righters are racist, but I'd say a large proportion of them have racist views. An example of Millennial Woes racism, just for the sake of the video, him nearly crying at the thought of Taylor Swift dating a black guy or a mixed race guy. It literally upset him to nearly the point of tears that her precious genes would be, not even her genes, but the fact that she would date outside of her race and potentially not breed with a white guy. That upset Millennial Woes. If you're not a racist, you don't give a shit what people you don't know do in their love lives. I literally couldn't care what any Hollywood celebrity or any random stranger on the street, I could not give less of a shit who they date, who they marry, who they have sex with. So, on that basis, it's pretty clear cut to me that Millennial Woes is a racist. And this is on top of my personal interactions with the guy. Now, Mark Collett is another legitimate alt-writer, another racist. He's affiliated and still has links and connections with the BNP / Nick Griffin. Those guys are absolutely balls deep in Jewish conspiracy theory stuff. So the racist canard of Jewish conspiracy theories, I think, is a legitimate form of racism that can be accurately classed and described as being on the far right. Defend Europa, I don't really know too much about them. The girl they had a picture of, I did use one of her articles as a source in my Muslim Problems in Britain video. We had some interactions a while ago on Twitter. She seemed all right. I can't really scrutinize her views. I don't know too much. Tara McCarthy is legitimate alt-right, and I don't know Morgoth's review. So from some credit back to the ridiculous, Hope Not Hate somewhat accurately attributed the alt-right moniker to alt-right individuals, but they go back to calling people that aren't for far right or organizations that aren't far right. So UKIP is a far right party. The top bit I'm not going to read, but the 2 paragraphs underneath are quite interesting. UKIP engages in hardline anti-Muslim rhetoric. Batten is a veteran anti-Muslim activist and has referred to Islam as a death cult, born and steeped in 1400 years of violence and bloodshed that propagates itself by intimidation, violence, and conquest. See, that is a fact. It's a historically accurate and fact-based statement. It's pretty much indisputable what he said there. And the funny thing about Hope Not Hate is they're Muslim apologists. Like most Muslim apologists, they don't understand Islam. Any Islamic fundamentalist or even semi-devout Muslim would agree with Gerard's description there. He has claimed that a normal non-Mohammedan should have a perfectly rational fear of Islam. Batten has defended his death cult comments. Well, Islam is a death cult. As I said, that's pretty much a fact. And his other statement about non-Muslim fearing Islam, I don't fear Islam, I just detest and revile Islam. I'm not scared of it, but given that Islam, not Islamism, not Islamic fundamentalism, core, normal, Wonder Bread Islam, everyday Islam, apple pie Islam, states that apostates should be killed, blasphemers should be killed, and in multiple Islamic countries, you can be killed or at least imprisoned for blaspheming or being an apostate. The punishment for apostasy in Islam is death, and no amount of fuckwittery from Hope Not Hate and other morons will get around this fact. It is a fact. At a Free Tommy event in July, Batten rallied against organised paedophile rape gangs made up of followers of the cult of Muhammad, who was himself a paedophile who kept sex slaves. Again, especially that last statement, Muhammad was a paedophile and he kept sex slaves. Again, statement of fact that doesn't reflect positively on Islam and on Muslims gets you deemed far right by these fucking far left freak ideologues known as Hope Not Hate. And here we go. Here's a tweet from Gerard Batten himself saying that UKIP is not a right-wing party. Now, Gerard's a bright guy. I'm not a UKIP guy, but Gerard's pretty good. He's an intelligent man, and quite frankly, I believe what he says. And UKIP has no history or literature declaring itself to be a right-wing party either. It wasn't then and it isn't now, even if it is a bit stronger on Islam. So I'll finish up on this, which in my eyes was a rather telling and glaring omission from Hope Not Hate. So I'll read the first bit of it, and it's relating Anne-Marie Waters, who of course they've done a little segment on For Britain being far right, etc. In June, Waters contested the Lewisham East by-election, receiving just 1.2% of the vote. And they leave it there. In the Lewisham East by-election, there was a hustings. A hustings is an opportunity for the candidates to meet in a public forum and debate each other and be questioned by the public. Anne-Marie Waters was prevented from attending this hustings due to far-left fascistic intimidation and threats of violence and actual violence. So the police, they say for her own safety, to be fair, she would have been attacked if she went. The police prevented her from attending, so the heckler's veto. So as fascist regimes do, they shut down events and people that they don't want to hear from with threats of violence and intimidation. And this is what the far left did. Now I'll link another video in the description showing the violence that people were subject to who were waiting outside at the hustings, people that weren't affiliated but just were not obviously on the far left. And the far left violence was perpetrated by Momentum thugs, Stand Up to Racism thugs, and maybe one or two Antifa were present. I can't quite remember. I'm not sure they were, but definitely Momentum and Stand Up to Racism types physically attacked people unprovoked and were abusive and aggressive to people unprovoked for just standing outside. All of this is on film. I don't think there were any arrests or anything, and it barely made the news. So in this example here, they completely omit far left violence. which is hilarious given their affiliations and links. Hope not hate I'm talking about here. Given their affiliations and links with far left, fascistic, violent groups such as Momentum, Stand Up to Racism, and Antifa. Joe Mulhall has directly communicated with Antifa to get them to go to events to physically attack people. So, incitement of violence. Who incites violence? Fascists. Uh, so, there we have it, more projection from far left ideologue authoritarians accusing others of what they themselves are and they themselves do. Now, this seems to be a trait for specifically far leftists and regressive leftists. And like most of my observations on them, it's the psychological angle is very, very telling and fascinating and intriguing to me. Just the weakness of these people, because I think projection is a manifestation of some sort of weakness and insecurity. And as I said before, with that other guy, he's overcompensating for his own racism, and the far left do this a lot.